Welcome to the Good News Show with me, Professor Grant Schofield. The Good News Show, where we challenge your frontal lobes. Good news, news that you can use to help you have a healthy and happy life. Not the bad news designed for your reptilian brain. This is the Good News Show. So let's go. A set of scientific papers have just been released in the journal Nutrients. And if you're involved in all of thinking about nutrition and what's good for you and what's bad for you and what we should say about what we should eat, these are landmark papers. The first paper in this special issue around the dietary guidelines around sodium intake and health. What should we recommend based on the current evidence? And really there's this idea, and it's been around for a long time, that recommending a low salt diet would somehow be good for us. It would reduce our blood pressure and reduce our chance of getting heart disease. And you can see what we've put up here are the recommendations from the American Heart Association, the World Health Organization, and the dietary guidelines for Americans, which are the same as for New Zealanders and Australians, as low salt diets are good for you. Unfortunately, what's actually good for you is a moderate sodium intake, which is what most of us are eating. Do we need to change our salt intake, and does it change our blood pressure? It might a wee bit, but you might want to go back to our work published in The Lancet in 2016, which points to the basic mechanism which is never discussed. So the good news is, if you've got high blood pressure and you want to change it, then the number one thing is to get the glucose in your blood and the insulin in your blood down, and your blood pressure will mostly resolve, because that's where sodium retention is controlled, at the kidney with glucose and insulin. That's not new in biology. That's good news. You can do something about that. You don't have to do that hypertensives. You don't have to do that medication. You get your diet right. Whole, healthy food low in human interference, food that was recently alive in nature. That's the template for controlling your blood pressure. We got the initial evidence wrong. We recommended low salt when we didn't need to. Don't go crazy with the salt, but do go crazy about sorting your glucose and insulin out. A new paper released in the journal Nutrients looks at how dietary saturated fat affects health and how it's affected the US dietary guidelines, but in fact all of the dietary guidelines around the world. And this is a really important thing, because the advice has been over the last 40 to 50 years that saturated fat, some of that fat that comes particularly in animal foods like fresh meats and cheeses and eggs and that sort of thing, causes the fat in your blood to go up. That causes atherosclerosis and heart disease. And thankfully, some of the experts around the world have finally come into this one paper, and this includes people who are already saying that like us for many decades, and some of the people who are actually on the Dietary Guidelines Committee and looking at that evidence. And they're saying, let me read to you some of what they're saying, the totality of the data on saturated fats and cardiovascular outcomes, which altogether have demonstrated a lack of rigorous evidence to support continued recommendations either to limit the consumption of saturated fatty acid or replace them with polyunsaturated fatty acids. In other words, they're saying that the papers that this is reviewed were not considered in the process leading to the most recent US dietary guidelines for Americans, the country's national nutrition policy, and probably the worldwide nutrition policy. The good news is that saturated fats shouldn't be minimised or limited or suggested to be replaced in the context of a whole food diet. If you're eating a whole food diet, includes whole plants and animals, go for your life, these things aren't going to give you a heart attack. Great news. This paper in the journal Nutrients is a very important one, demonstrating how alternative dietary patterns, particularly low carbohydrate diets, they say for Americans, but they mean all people in the world, are a healthy, evidence-based, important approach to how we eat. Authors of this paper, Jeff Volek and Steve Finney, important world leaders in low-carb research, Ron Krauss, a well-credentialed cardiologist, and a bunch of other people who were also involved in the dietary guideline recommendations which excluded this, are now showing us material that says, we argue that personalising the level of dietary carbohydrate should be a high priority based on evidence that Americans have a wide spectrum of metabolic variability in their tolerance to high carbohydrate loads. They go on to say that low carbohydrate diets are grounded across the time span of human evolution, have well-established biochemical principles, are now supported by multiple clinical trials in humans that demonstrate consistent improvements in multiple established risk factors associated with insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. What they're saying is that once and for all, we missed the boat, that for many of us, restricting our carbs, going on a low-carb diet in the context of whole healthy food is going to be nothing but beneficial for us. So bring it on. That's the good news. Yummy, whole, healthy food, low-carb diets. Here's a really interesting paper that's just come out this week in really the most prestigious journal in nutrition, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it looks at it's a weight loss, then an isocaloric feeding study. And why would you be interested in this? You'd be interested in this because this has been a massive area of debate. How do they do this? They did it in a special sort of way. So people joined the study. They got some measures. They went on a 16-week weight loss program. Everyone got the same weight loss program, and people were randomized now to 3 types of diets. And they're all healthy food diets, but in different macronutrient compositions. So a lowish fat, a low saturated fat, higher carbohydrate diet, a moderate carbohydrate Mediterranean style diet, and a lower carbohydrate ketogenic style diet with higher amounts of fat and saturated fat, and a lower amount of carbohydrate. And these were not weight loss diets at this point. People maintained their weight and they measured a few things. So here it comes. This is a very, very important figure. Let's figure out what it says. So you've got percent change on the y-axis. Each of those bars, looking at the leftmost ones, represents a different diet allocation. So your insulin resistance improved by around 15%. If you're on the low carbohydrate diet, nothing happened to it on the Mediterranean diet, and it got worse on the high carbohydrate diet. That's interesting, isn't it? So if you want to improve your insulin resistance, go on a low carb diet. Don't go on a high carb diet. Mediterranean diet won't do much either way. Next one in the middle there, Lp(a), is a lipoprotein that carries apolipoprotein B, the atherogenic particles. If you wanted to get a close measure to atherogenic lipids in your blood, Lp(a) would be it. And guess what? They improve remarkably when you eat more fat, including saturated fat, and nothing happened to them on the other 2 types of diets. And lastly, just LDL, low density lipoprotein, often called the bad cholesterol. I don't think we think that, but got slightly higher in all 3 diets. No difference between diets, nothing to see there. Interesting study. Good news is, if you want to improve your insulin resistance, then you just restrict your dietary carbohydrates. Go for your life. Here's a cool paper coming out this week. Incident major depressive disorder predicted by 3 measures of insulin resistance, a Dutch cohort study. So it's not a trial, it's a prospective study. It follows people, but it was in the American Journal of Psychiatry 2021. Interesting study purely because of the magnitude of the effects. 601 Dutch people, no history of any psychiatric problems. Over a 4-year period, 14% of them went on to develop major depressive disorder. Ouch, that seems quite bad. What predicted that? Actually, a whole bunch of metabolic things predicted that, particularly the triglyceride to HDL ratio in the blood was a predictor of going on, and it's, you're almost twice as likely to get major depressive disorder if that's in a bad state. In other words, your triglycerides are high, your HDL's low. How do you improve that? Well, you eat better. You sort out the sugar and starch and the ultra-processed food, and you get rid of that, and you eat some more whole, actual food, including plenty of healthy fats. They also show the same here, similar things, but if you actually went on to get pre-diabetes, then you're getting up to almost 3 times the chance of getting major depressive disorders. Important paper. Good news is that there's some metabolic basis, probably, at least the hypothesis from this is that there is, to major depressive disorder and depression and mood in general, and it's metabolic, inflammation, oxidative stress, glycation. The things in your food that affect your metabolism also affect your brain. And you'd expect that, right? Because your brain's a metabolic organ. So, good news, sort your diet out, hopefully sort your mood out. How about this paper? Just out. It's been a big week for scientific papers, really, in my field. In the American Journal of Physiology, Endocrinology and Metabolism, Acute Carbohydrate Overfeeding, a redox model of insulin action and its impact on metabolic dysfunction in humans. Whew, that sounds quite hard. Actually, it is, and you go and look at their diagram, and if you're not a molecular biochemist, you really won't know what the hell's going on, but let's interpret that for you. In the study, an experimental study, they overfed people with carbohydrates and didn't overfeed them, and what they notice is this. We tested the hypothesis that carbohydrate overfeeding predisposes to oxidative stress by channeling electrons away from antioxidants to support energy storage. So what they mean there is that when you overfeed with carbohydrate, you promote oxidative stress. That's the problem. It does that because glucose takes away glutathione, an antioxidant, and it changes electron composition, and because of the energy storage, you actually end up negating the body's own internal mechanisms to deal with oxidative stress. So the good news is you can avoid all this. How do you avoid it? Don't overfeed yourself with carbs and sugar and ultra-processed food. Eat what you need. Eat a diet in whole, healthy food, and you're going to feel great. Good news. In a week of an avalanche of nutrition and metabolism research, there's this paper in Preventive Medicine looking at a commentary, really, looking at heart disease, the forgotten pandemic. There's a lot of talk about COVID and the COVID pandemic at the moment. And first of all, I think if you want to listen to Paul Taylor and my podcast on the elephant in the room there, we'll put the link in the notes below, then I think you'll agree that probably we're all going to eventually get COVID. Get yourself vaccinated if that's your decision, and carry on, but carry on about being healthy as well, because metabolic health is the single most important thing in preventing bad outcomes in that pandemic. It's also the single most important thing in preventing bad outcomes in this other pandemic, the forgotten pandemic, heart disease. And they go on to criticize this model where we've seen, well, in recent years, increases in heart disease mortality again, while serum LDL cholesterol in Americans has kept dropping. And it was really up until 2010, this ecological argument, which was a bit dodgy anyway, was that because LDL was falling in people's blood, especially Americans, and so was heart disease death, that these two things were associated, and we should carry on taking our statins, eating our high-carb diets, and avoiding our saturated fat. And even the ecological argument, the weakest argument and the only argument that existed, because the randomized evidence doesn't show that, prospective evidence doesn't show that, that's gone now as well. So good news is concentrate on your metabolic health, sort your COVID risk out, sort your heart disease risk out. Great news. That's the Good News Show. I'm Grant Schofield. The Good News Show brought to you by PreKure.com.